Hello, government students. In our last lesson, we talked about the events that led up to the Constitutional Convention and then the events that happened during the Constitutional Convention, which led to the drafting of the document which we have today and still live under, the United States Constitution. However, when the delegates at the Constitutional Convention came up with that document, that was just step one. They still had to actually have the Constitution approved by the states. You actually at this time had to have 9 of the states approve the Constitution before it would go into effect. And that was not a guarantee. There was still strong opposition against a strong national government in the United States. And so let's go ahead and talk about the process that happened that ultimately got this government on its feet. As soon as the Constitutional Convention ended, and you see the ending here with the delegates counting the votes for this new document, as soon as it ended, there very quickly became two parties that formed, those who were for the Constitution and those who were against it. And we call them Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were the people who favored the new Constitution and they wanted a strong national government. And of course, then the Anti-Federalists were people who opposed the Constitution. They feared a strong national government. They had just gotten out of from under the hands of a strong national government in the form of Great Britain. They didn't want a repeat of that. The main Anti-Federalist objections can really be summarized in just a few things. They felt that a large country would be harmful to individual freedom. They argued that individual freedom, that democracy only thrives in a very small country, which would be similar to the states, not the large United States. They felt that the executive branch was too powerful as it had been envisioned by Madison and others. The national government, they believed, had too much power versus the state government. And then the idea that the national government could maintain an army during peacetime was concerning. Why would you need an army during the times of peace? They felt that the only purpose of an army would be to be used. And who would they use that army against in peacetime? They would use it against the people of the United States. That was the fear. They're also concerned that although the Constitution talked a lot about the powers of the government, it never mentioned the individual rights of the people. Individual rights were not protected by this thing. It just talked about the power of the government. And then the Article 1 of the Constitution, which deals with the legislative branch and the powers of Congress, has something at the end of it called the Elastic Clause. The Elastic Clause can be found in your textbook, actually, on page A7, appendix page 7. It's the last clause in Section 8 of the Constitution. And here's what it says. By the way, we also call it the Necessary and Proper Clause because it says Congress may make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, that is, all the powers that the Constitution had talked about up to this point, the execution of foregoing powers and all other powers vested in this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. What this means is that basically Congress has the power to do whatever it feels it needs to do in order to do what it has to do. That's kind of a funny way of saying it, but basically it's a power that's given that's not really clearly defined. Congress can decide what they need to do, and this was an idea that the Anti-Federalists believed was expanding power way beyond what was called for. Congress could do whatever it wants to do. It's called the Elastic Clause because it stretches the power of the government, and that was scary to the Anti-Federalists. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 9 states had to approve the Constitution. Several states were very much, it was given. Pennsylvania had strong support for the Constitution. A lot of the states did. But there were 2 big important states whose ratification of the Constitution was somewhat in doubt, and that's Virginia and Pennsylvania. And look at how big, first of all, Virginia was at this time. Virginia included a lot more than present-day Virginia, and it was the largest state in the Union. Pennsylvania was a close second, and and New York was a close third. I apologize. If either of these two giant states should not go along with the Constitution, then this country probably isn't going to be successful. It would split the country in two. Massachusetts would be isolated from the bulk of the country if New York doesn't join. Virginia being the largest and stretching so far out west at that time, again, it would split the country in two, and the country just can't survive. It would not be a unified country without these two states. It's vital for them to join. So there is an effort that's undertaken to make sure that these two states do in fact agree to the new Constitution. And James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and a man named John Jay take the lead in this, and they write something called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are among the most important documents ever written on governance in the history of the world, and the authors are, again, those three men. It's 85 articles that argue for a new constitution, and these articles were written in response to anti-federalist letters that had been written to newspapers and complaints by anti-federalists. Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of the Federalist Papers, Madison wrote 29, and John Jay, a little-known founding father of our country, wrote 5. He probably would have written more, but he was ill during the time that this was going on. They wrote the Federalist Papers anonymously. The only reason we know who wrote which ones now are because Alexander Hamilton kept a very detailed record of the writing of the Federalist Papers, and when he died in the early 1800s, in going through his papers, we discovered who wrote which of the articles. Excuse me. Interesting thing about these guys, after the United States gets on its feet and is doing well, all three of these men made a big impact. Hamilton was our first Secretary of the Treasury, and our whole economic system is based on the framework that he put together. Madison, of course, became our 4th United States President, and John Jay was the first Chief Justice, our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So they were all three very important men, even after the Federalist Papers and these events were taking place. So, we all know that the Federalists ultimately win because we do have the Constitution in effect today. So let's look at some of the reasons why the Federalists won. First of all, everyone knew that the Articles of Confederation had serious flaws. Something had to be done. There were these terrible economic problems, which we had discussed in our previous lesson, that convinced many people that something needed to be done. The United States was bankrupt. Couldn't do anything, trade wasn't working, the economy was just in shambles. The very name Federalist, in a way, is propagandistic. Federalism is the division of power between state and national government. When we talk about a division of power, that implies then that the state governments have power as well as the national government. The whole argument was that the national government, Anti-Federalists felt, was too strong. And so by taking this name Federalist, it says, no, not at all. We're giving states power. Okay, we believe in federalism. The power does reside with states. We share power. Okay, so that name is a positive name. The Federalists had a plan, the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists had no real plan of their own. They just didn't like what the Federalists were doing. Well, I tell you what, if you're going to complain about something, then you need to have an alternative proposed. The Anti-Federalists really didn't have anything. So that works against them seriously. So, continuing on, the Federalists were very well organized. They were a national group in regular contact with one another. The Anti-Federalists did not coordinate their activities on a national level. Kind of the way this would work. Let's say Virginia is coming up to take a vote on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. The Federalists would target Virginia with the Federalist Papers and with campaigns in favor of the Constitution. They would have people on the street corners and on the town squares, advocating for this new Constitution. And once the vote was taken in Virginia, they would move on to the next state. The Anti-Federalists were not organized in that way, and that hurts them long term. The Federalists then also had the war hero George Washington on their side. This was a huge issue, a huge advantage to the Federalists. George Washington is still the most popular man in the country. If he's for this thing, then this must be a good idea. And in fact, most people assumed that George Washington would in fact be the first president. And again, that's going to help sell people on this idea. So the Constitution was adopted. Several states, though, decided we're only going to ratify this thing if there is a Bill of Rights. Remember what I said, the Constitution talked about the powers of the government. It did not talk about the rights of the people. So several states say we're not going to ratify it unless you add a Bill of Rights. So the Federalists agreed to support a Bill of Rights as long as those states do in fact ratify the Constitution first. Those states agreed that was good enough for them. So on June 21, 1788, the Constitution was ratified, and on March 24th, 1789, it went into effect. George Washington became president, Congress convened, and we have a new government replacing the Articles of Confederation. And the Bill of Rights did, in fact, come about. It took 2 years or so for the Bill of Rights to be approved, but they did get approved. And they were based basically on the 1776 Declaration of Rights in Virginia. And that too had been based on previous things out of Great Britain, such as the English Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights then goes into effect December the 15th, 1791, 2 years after the start of the new government under the presidency of George Washington. So that's it for this lesson, and check Canvas. We have an important, fairly significant assignment for you in dual credit today. And if you're not in dual credit, you also have an assignment today that you need to take a look at in Canvas and get busy with that. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions. You can email me if you're not in class. Just make sure you understand what's going on, and we'll talk to you later.